My name is Dan Mitchell with the Cato Institute. We're here to talk with Dambisa Moyo, a best-selling author, about her new book, How the West Was Lost. Dambisa, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Let's jump right in. Your basic premise: the West is being overtaken by the East. Give us the nutshell explanation of what it's all about.
So it's quite interesting because we're in this bizarre time in society where we're almost obsessed with what's going on in the East, with what's going on in China and other places. And of course, it's incredibly fascinating. But my book is really about the errors that have been made here in the United States and in Europe. These are homegrown problems around policy and that have absolutely nothing to do with China. Things like education, all the structural problems like infrastructure, things like energy policy that really don't have anything to do with China and really are essential to get right, to make sure that the US and European countries are back on the right track.
Well, it's almost as if there's a couple of different books in one book. There's your story of the decline of the West, there's your story of the rise of the East, and I guess the basic premise is, the lines are going to cross.
Well, I mean, I think this is, you can argue that there's an absolute part, for sure, talking about the West in its isolation and what the issues are going on there. And then, of course, we live in an amazing time when China and many other emerging economies have done the unthinkable, moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So, of course, it's going to naturally be a relative question as well, worth discussing, which is what I've done in the book.
Well, let's start by talking about what's going wrong in the West.
Sure. So, first of all, I think it's really important that in terms of the context of my work, I talk about unintended consequences, things that seemingly on the surface sound like good intentions, but actually yield bad outcomes. And what I've done in this book is to focus on the three key ingredients that economists focus on as the drivers of economic growth. And those are capital, which is basically money, labor, which is basically the workforce, and then finally productivity, how efficiently you can do stuff. And what I'm arguing in here is really to provide a catalog of the policies that have been instituted in the United States and across Europe over the past 50 years that have led to the erosion of these three key ingredients that drive economic growth. And so very simply, and I'm sure we'll get into more detail on this, but to give you an example, the idea of housing for all, housing policy for all, which has been a mainstay of American policy, both for Republicans and Democrats, on paper sounds like a great idea. We want everybody to have shelter over their heads. But in principle, the manner in which it's been executed has led clearly to a situation where we've had the subprime crisis. The idea of keeping interest rates historically low, the idea of having a policy of subsidies and guarantees have clearly induced behaviors that have led to the subprime crisis.
Well, when you talk about what we've done wrong in America, but also other Western nations as well, part of it is that we live for today, we consume, we go for the free lunch. Elaborate on that.
Yes, I mean, I think what we're also facing right now in places like the United States is the competition or the sort of test between the current generation and the future generation. We have to decide whether there are going to be sacrifices, which is what I'm arguing in the book, sacrifices for people today so that the United States tomorrow can remain a preeminent economic power. Clearly, there were promises that were made. Pensions is a classic example of this. That are simply unsustainable, and it's going to be impossible to fulfill those promises. And so the question then becomes, how much of a sacrifice are people willing to make today in the United States in order to make sure that tomorrow we can have a reasonably educated population, you can have decent infrastructure, and so on.
Now, what happens if we don't make the sacrifice? Because that's sort of your warning in the book, that because we're on this wrong path and because there seems to be this short-termism and consumption attitude, what happens if we don't fix things?
Well, the main problem with the consumption, as we know, both at the public, the government level, and at the individual level in this country and across Europe, it's been financed by debt. And the concerns with that, it's unsustainable. If the debt had been used to finance investment, for example, we probably wouldn't be sitting here because I think there'd be a lot of productive investments that you might have seen come out of that. But we have a very different situation. So what could happen? Well, I think in many ways Europe is a harbinger of the sort of things that could happen. You end up with riots, unsustainable budgets, very often lead to bailouts. I was just in California. I mean, there are serious concerns around infrastructure there, but also very fundamentally around their budget deficits. They have furloughs. I mean, those types of things can put a lot of stress on an economy, and I think that's very much where you're heading if you don't solve these fiscal problems.
So in other words, in your book, if we don't fix things in the United States and also other countries as well, Greece is our future?
Well, I think that's pretty evident. I mean, I think what people perhaps don't appreciate, although Greece is coming from a very different background, the fact of the matter is that you are having increases in income inequality. People will be frustrated that they have to work longer than they had perhaps had anticipated. The government is simply not going to be able to continue to finance all the programs that it's promised to, and all of that leads to an unwind, and obviously leads to, you have many more labor disputes, you have issues around the government's ability to finance things like infrastructure, like education, like energy policy, and that's where I'm afraid you would lead to.
Now, how much of this is demographics? Is it solely just a result of a big baby boom generation retiring and a one-time spike in costs for an elderly population, or is there something more permanent and systemic in our troubles?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that are demographically linked. I mean, clearly, even the property boom, the prices going up was clearly supported by baby boomers who were willing to pay for housing. And obviously, looking ahead, issues around pensions, around healthcare are very strongly linked to the issues of demographics. But I think there are more systemic issues that are flowing through the U.S. economy. Things like education. The fact that the United States has gone from being #1 in college graduates to being number 12 in one generation is essentially incredibly problematic for America's ability to compete over the long term. If you look at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development studies, they have a study called PISA study. If you look at the performance of American students in mathematics, in sciences, in reading, they've actually slid from being in the top 1 to 3 down to being in the 20s and in the teens and high teens and 20s. That's problematic, especially for America's competitiveness. The fact that the United States today has around 30 to 50 million people out of work in the manufacturing sector, when we know that these people are not competitive globally on a cost basis, again, is not something that's necessarily linked to demographics. It's simply about competitiveness, and that's where there's a concern.
And when you talk about pensions, there's obviously many pieces to that. There's the federal government Social Security program.
Yeah.
There are underfunded pensions in the private sector. And then, of course, and we're seeing this with some of the debates in the U.S. states.
Absolutely.
Huge underfunding of the pension promises to state and local government workers. Do you distinguish between those three different types, and are some worse than the others?
Well, I have written a lot about this. I mean, I think that they are all, the sort of overarching umbrella of all pensions is that there are promises that are unsustainable. In finance, we'd call them out of the money options that we're just not going to be able to pay. We've already seen in the private sector whole industries that have basically hit bankruptcy because of the pension problem, whether it's the airline sector, the steel sector, or the auto sector. We've already seen what the implications of that could be. At the state level, California, classic example, they've got furloughs now where people are forced not to go to work because the government doesn't want to, or the state does not want to accrue additional liabilities. And clearly this obviously feeds up into this federal level. So I don't distinguish. I mean, of course, in terms of numbers and what it looks like, you can look at what the overarching liabilities are, but the main thesis, so the sort of thread running through all of this, are promises that are simply not going to be able to be paid.
Now, if we're talking about promises that aren't able to be paid, at some point, if you're California, when do you become Greece, in the sense, when do investors decide, we don't trust California anymore, we're not going to buy their bonds? California can still issue debt at a reasonably low interest rates. But we're seeing Greece has already reached the point where they had to get a bailout. Portugal's teetering on the edge, where investors are now demanding very high interest rates before they buy Portuguese debt. When does that happen to California or Illinois, and when does it happen to the federal government here?
So I mean, I think that the one thing that I'm constantly reminded is that politics tends to bail out these type of situations, and California is not, although it is a state, it's not standalone in the sense that it is part of the United States of America. They have a common currency, so the implications are far more reaching than just California having problems in of itself, and the federal government would not have missed that as a point. So, whether or not California will get bailed out, I mean, I'm certain that somebody will come to the rescue, but that sort of doesn't preclude your sort of more underlying issue, which is that if interest rates start to rise, which we're already seeing, between September and now, the 10-year interest rate in the United States has gone up by about 100 basis points. So there's a lot of pressure on debt and interest payments. So those types of pressures tend to force not just states but also governments to a situation where they're not able to make payments and they have to make trade-offs with public spending, for example.